They said she was worthless, a burden chained to a fence in the scorching sun, sold to pay a dead man's debt. The town laughed. The banker smiled. And Mira Langley knew she had minutes before her life became someone else's property. But then a shadow fell across the dirt, a tall cowboy with silver in his pocket and sorrow in his eyes. What he did next silenced an entire town and changed two broken lives forever. This is the story of the girl they called a burden, and the land that made her a queen. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rope burns on Mira Langley's wrists had stopped bleeding an hour ago, but the shame, oh, the shame was still fresh, still raw, still burning hotter than the autumn sun beating down on Wolf Hollow's main street. She stood tied to the split-rail fence outside Hutchins' general store, her back pressed against the splintered wood, her dark hair falling in tangled waves across a face that had once been soft but was now all edges and exhaustion. 22 years old and already written off like a bad debt. 22 years old and displayed like livestock at auction. The town had gathered, as towns always did when there was blood in the water. Mira kept her chin high, even as her knees shook. Even as the whispers cut deeper than any blade. Heard her daddy drank himself to death. Left her with nothing but debts and a crooked spine. $42.80. Might as well be $400 for all she's worth. Porter's sending her to Denver. To one of those houses, if you know what I mean. Mira knew exactly what they meant. She'd known the moment Samuel Porter, the banker with the too wide smile and the eyes like a snake's, had appeared at her door 3 days after they'd buried her father in the cemetery on the hill. Her father, a man who'd loved her fiercely, but loved whiskey more, who'd worked the mines until his lungs gave out, who'd borrowed and borrowed and borrowed until there was nothing left but a daughter and a debt. $42.80. It might as well have been the moon. Samuel Porter had smiled his snake smile and said, "Now, Miss Langley, we can work something out. A girl like you, young, pretty enough when you're cleaned up, well, there's always work in Denver. The Silver Palace is always hiring. 6 months, maybe a year, and that debt's cleared. Otherwise," he'd let the word hang like a noose. "Otherwise, I'm well within my rights to have you arrested for theft. Your daddy took that money under false pretenses." "He took it to pay for medicine," Mira had whispered, "for his lungs." "And where is he now?" Porter had asked, still smiling. "Dead, and that makes you responsible." So here she stood, wrists tied, dressed in the same brown calico dress she'd worn to her father's funeral, the fabric stained with sweat and dirt, her boots, her only good pair, scuffed nearly through at the toes. The crowd had grown as the afternoon wore on. Farmers in from the outskirts, shopkeepers closing early to watch the spectacle. Even Reverend Michaels had come, though he stood at the back, hands clasped, eyes downcast, saying nothing. Nobody said anything that mattered. Porter stood beside her like a ringmaster, his black suit immaculate despite the dust, his voice carrying across the street with practiced ease. "Folks, I don't enjoy this any more than you do," he announced, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "But the law is the law." Thomas Langley owed the Wolf Hollow Bank $42.80. He signed a promissory note. He's dead, and his estate consists of one daughter and a rented shack with nothing in it worth selling. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I've arranged employment for Miss Langley in Denver. Good, honest work. Someone in the crowd snickered. A woman spat into the dirt. "But she'll need an escort," Porter continued smoothly. "The stage leaves at 4 o'clock. Until then, she'll remain here, as collateral, so to speak, to ensure she doesn't run." Mira had tried not to run. She'd tried to be brave, to face this the way her mother, dead these 10 years, would have wanted. But when Porter had tied her wrists and looped the rope around the fence post, when he'd stepped back and dusted off his hands like he'd just finished a good day's work, something inside her had cracked. She'd lunged, not away, toward him. She'd gotten her hands around his throat for maybe 3 seconds before 2 men had dragged her back, and Porter had struck her across the face hard enough to snap her head sideways and split her lip. Blood had filled her mouth, coppery and hot, and the crowd had gasped, not in outrage, but in shock that she'd dared. "Settle down, girl," Porter had hissed, his face red, his snake eyes glittering. "You just earned yourself an extra $10 in damages. Assault." And that had been that. Now the sun was sinking lower, shadows stretching long across the street, and Mira could feel the weight of every stare, every judgment, every person who'd ever smiled at her father while he was alive and now acted like his daughter was poison. She closed her eyes and thought about running anyway, about waiting until dark, gnawing through the ropes with her teeth if she had to, disappearing into the hills. She knew the land. She'd grown up here. She could survive. But Porter had men. Porter had connections. And girls who ran from debts ended up in worse places than Denver. So she stood and waited and prayed for something, anything, to change. The sound came first. A low rumble of wagon wheels on packed dirt, the creak of wood and the jingle of harness. The crowd shifted, turning as one toward the southern end of the street where the road widened into the main thoroughfare. Mira opened her eyes. A wagon was rolling into town, pulled by two sturdy draft horses, their coats dappled gray and gleaming with sweat. The driver sat tall on the bench, his shoulders broad beneath a dusty leather duster, his hat pulled low enough to shadow his face. But it wasn't the man who caught Mira's attention, it was the three children sitting in the wagon bed behind him. A boy, maybe 12, with dark hair and serious eyes. Another boy, younger, 8 or 9, clutching a wooden horse. And a little girl, no more than 6, her blonde braids tied with faded blue ribbons, her small hands gripping the side of the wagon as she stared wide-eyed at the gathered crowd. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the general store, just a few yards from where Mira stood tied. The driver climbed down slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had seen too many hard years. When he straightened and pushed back his hat, Mira saw his face for the first time. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, maybe older, the kind of age that was hard to pin down when it had been earned through work and weather. His face was all sharp lines and sun-carved angles, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes a pale, startling blue beneath dark brows. There was a scar along his left temple, faint but noticeable, and another across the back of his right hand as he reached up to help the little girl down from the wagon. "Stay close, Liddy," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, like gravel tumbling over stone. "Noah, Cal, watch your sister." The boys climbed down, flanking the little girl protectively, and the man, Coulter Reeves, Mira would learn later, though she didn't know it yet, turned toward the store and stopped. His gaze swept across the crowd, slow and assessing, and then landed on Mira. For a moment their eyes met, his pale blue, hers dark brown, and something flickered in his expression. Not pity, not disgust, something harder to name. He looked at the rope around her wrists, at the bruise blooming purple along her cheekbone, at the blood dried at the corner of her mouth. Then he looked at Samuel Porter, who'd been watching the wagon with the kind of interest a fox shows a henhouse. "Afternoon, Mr. Reeves," Porter said smoothly, stepping forward with his hand extended. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." Coulter didn't take his hand. "Porter." The banker's smile didn't falter, but his hand dropped. "Just handling a bit of business, nothing that concerns you." Coulter's gaze shifted back to Mira, then to the crowd, then back to Porter. "That girl, what's her crime?" Porter waved a dismissive hand. "Debt. Her father died owing the bank. She's being relocated to Denver to work it off." "Work it off how?" The question was quiet, but it carried. Porter's smile tightened. "That's between her and her new employer." "How much?" "I beg your pardon?" "The debt." Coulter's voice hadn't changed, still low, still rough. But there was something under it now, something cold and immovable. "How much?" Porter hesitated, his eyes narrowing. $52.80, $42 for the original loan, $10 for damages. Damages? "She attacked me." Porter gestured to his throat where faint red marks were still visible. "Witnesses saw it." Coulter looked at Mira again. She stared back, her breath shallow, her mind racing. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he was asking, didn't dare hope it meant anything. $52.80, Coulter repeated. "That's what you're selling her for." Porter's face flushed. "I'm not selling anyone, Mr. Reeves. This is a legal matter." "You tied-byed her to a fence and called the town to watch." Coulter stepped closer, and despite the fact that Porter was a head shorter, the banker took a step back. That's not law. That's a show. The crowd had gone silent. Even the children in the wagon had stopped fidgeting, sensing the shift in the air. Porter licked his lips. The debt is still owed. I'll pay it. The words dropped like stones into still water. Mira's breath caught. Porter blinked. The crowd murmured, a ripple of confusion and curiosity. You'll... What? Porter stammered. I'll pay the debt. Coulter reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it, counted out coins slowly, silver dollars mostly, with a few gold eagles, and stacked them on the edge of the wagon bed. $52.80. Count it. Porter stared at the money like it might bite him. Mr. Reeves, I don't think you understand. I understand a man died and left his daughter with a debt she didn't make. Coulter's voice was still quiet, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade. I understand you're about to put her on a stage to Denver to work in a whorehouse, and I understand that if I pay what's owed, she's free. Am I wrong? Porter's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No, he said finally, his voice tight. You're not wrong. Then take the money. Porter looked at the coins, at Coulter, at Mira, still tied to the fence, her eyes wide and disbelieving. Then he stepped forward and swept the money into his hands, counting quickly, his fingers shaking slightly. $52.80, he muttered, paid in full. Coulter turned to Mira. He pulled a knife from his belt, a long, worn blade with a bone handle, and crossed to her in 3 strides. She flinched instinctively, but he didn't reach for her. He reached for the rope. Hold still, he said. She did. The knife sliced through the rope in one clean motion, and Mira's hands dropped to her sides, free for the first time in hours. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, that her knees buckled. Coulter caught her elbow, steadying her, his grip firm but not rough. You all right? He asked quietly. Mira nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Coulter looked at Porter, who was still standing with the money clutched in his hands, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. She's free now, Coulter said. We done here? Porter's jaw worked. Yes, he bit out. We're done. Good. Coulter turned back to Mira, his pale eyes studying her face. You got family in town? She shook her head. Anywhere to go? Another shake. He was silent for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded once, as if he'd made a decision. Come with us. Mira blinked. What? Come with us, he repeated. Back to the ranch. You can work off the debt there if that's what you need, or you can just stay until you figure out what's next. Either way, you're not getting on that stage. She stared at him, her mind spinning. Why? Because I don't like what I saw here today. He glanced at the crowd and several people looked away. And because my children need someone who knows how to keep a house. Their mother's been gone 2 years, and I'm no good at it. Mira looked at the wagon, where the 3 children were watching her with wide, wary eyes. The little girl, Liddy, tilted her head, curious. The boys were more guarded, their faces closed off. But they didn't look cruel, just cautious. I don't know you, Mira said softly. No, Coulter agreed. You don't. But you don't know anyone in Denver either, and I'm offering you a choice. That's more than you had 5 minutes ago. He was right. And Mira, who had stopped believing in miracles somewhere around the time her father's coffin had been lowered into the ground, felt the faintest flicker of something she didn't dare name. Hope. Okay, she whispered. Coulter nodded. He turned to the children. Noah, help her into the wagon. Cal, make room. The older boy climbed down and extended a hand to Mira, his expression solemn. She took it, her legs shaking, and let him guide her to the wagon bed. She climbed in carefully, her body aching from hours of standing in the sun, and settled onto a rough wool blanket near the back. Liddy scooted closer, her small face serious. Are you coming home with us? Mira's throat tightened. I think so. Good, Liddy said simply. Daddy burns the biscuits. Despite everything, despite the fear and the exhaustion and the sheer unreality of the last few minutes, Mira felt her lips twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. Coulter climbed back onto the driver's bench and gathered the reins. He glanced back once, his eyes meeting Mira's, and nodded. Then he turned to the crowd, his voice carrying, "Anyone got a problem with this? Speak now." No one spoke. Good. He flicked the reins and the horses started forward, the wagon rolling slowly down the main street. The crowd parted, silent, watching as the girl who'd been tied to a fence disappeared into the dust. Mira didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Behind her, the town of Wolf Hollow faded into the distance. Ahead, the sun was setting, spilling gold and crimson across the sky, and the road stretched out into the unknown. The Reeves Ranch sat 15 miles south of Wolf Hollow, nestled in a valley where the land rolled green and gold, dotted with clusters of pine and aspens that whispered in the wind. The house itself was modest, a 2-story frame structure with a wide porch and a roof that had seen better days, but it was solid, and it was surrounded by the kind of space that made Mira's breath catch. Pastures stretched out in every direction, bordered by split-rail fences and dotted with cattle. A barn stood to the east, red paint fading but sturdy, with a corral beside it where horses grazed in the twilight. Beyond that, the land rose into foothills, dark against the deepening sky. It was beautiful, and it was more than Mira had ever dreamed of. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Coulter climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate. He helped Liddy down first, then turned to Mira. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you inside." Mira climbed out of the wagon, her legs stiff and aching, and followed him up the porch steps. The wood creaked under her weight, and she could see where boards had been patched, where nails had been hammered in at odd angles. It was a house held together by necessity, not luxury. Coulter pushed open the front door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading light through the windows. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a long wooden table in the center. The furniture was sparse, a pair of worn chairs, a battered sofa, a bookshelf with more gaps than books. Everything was clean, more or less, but there was a weariness to it, a sense of a place that had been tended out of duty rather than love. Liddy ran past Mira and climbed onto one of the chairs, her small feet swinging. Noah and Cal followed more slowly, lingering near the door as if unsure what came next. Coulter closed the door and set his hat on a peg. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward a doorway on the left. "Bedroom's upstairs. There's a spare room, used to be the sewing room, but it's empty now. You can have that." Mira nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe me thanks. You'll earn your keep, same as anyone." "I will," Mira said quickly. "I promise. I'm a good worker. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." "Good." He crossed to the fireplace and knelt to start building a fire. "Supper's usually around 6. I'll show you the kitchen tomorrow, let you get the lay of things. Tonight, just rest. You look like you need it." Mira wanted to argue, to insist she could start now, prove she was worth the $52.80 he'd spent on her. But her body was screaming for rest, and her mind was a tangled mess of fear and gratitude and sheer disbelief. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. Coulter didn't turn around. "Noah, show her the spare room. Cal, help me with the fire. Liddy, get the bread from the wagon." The children moved, each one slipping into their role like they'd done it 100 times before. Noah motioned for Mira to follow him, and she did, climbing the narrow staircase to the second floor. The spare room was small, barely big enough for a bed and a chest of drawers, but it had a window that looked out over the valley, and the bed, though narrow, was covered in a clean quilt. "This is it," Noah said quietly. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved in his pockets, his dark eyes watching her carefully. "There's a wash basin in the corner, water pumps out back." "Thank you," Mira said. "Noah, right?" He nodded. "Thank you, Noah." He shrugged, uncomfortable, and turned to leave, but he paused at the door, glancing back. "My pa doesn't do things like that, what he did in town." Mira frowned. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't interfere. He keeps to himself, keeps us to ourselves." Noah's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "So if he brought you here, it's because he thinks you're worth it. Don't prove him wrong." Before Mira could respond, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. She stood alone in the small room, her heart pounding, and sank slowly onto the edge of the bed. Worth it. She didn't feel worth anything. She felt like a girl who'd been tied to a fence and put on display, a girl whose father had drunk himself to death and left her with nothing but shame. But Coulter Reeves had paid $52.80 to cut her loose, and she would spend every day proving Noah right. Mira woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the pale light of dawn creeping through the window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it came back in a rush, the fence, the crowd, the stranger with the pale blue eyes who'd bought her freedom. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked around the small room. Someone had left a jug of water on the chest of drawers, along with a clean towel and a bar of soap. Mira stared at them for a long moment, her throat tight, then rose and washed her face and hands, scrubbing away the dust and dried blood until her skin was pink and raw. When she came downstairs, the house was already awake. Coulter stood at the stove, frowning at a pan of something that looked like eggs but smelled faintly of burnt leather. Noah and Cal sat at the table, poking at plates of toast with the kind of resignation that suggested this was a common occurrence. Liddy sat on the floor near the fireplace, braiding the tail of a rag doll. Coulter looked up when Mira appeared, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "Morning?" "Morning," Mira said quietly. "Can I help?" He glanced at the stove, then at her, and stepped aside without a word. Mira crossed to the stove and looked at the pan. The eggs were beyond saving, black around the edges and stuck to the iron. She set the pan aside and reached for a clean one. "Start over?" she asked. Coulter nodded. "Yeah." For the next 30 minutes, Mira worked. She cooked eggs, real eggs, soft and yellow and edible. She made toast that didn't crumble into charcoal. She found a jar of preserves in the pantry and set it on the table along with butter and a pot of coffee that actually tasted like coffee. The children ate like they'd been starving, which, based on the state of the kitchen, they probably had been. Liddy hummed between bites, kicking her feet under the table. Cal asked for seconds. Even Noah, the serious one, finished his plate and nodded at Mira with something that might have been approval. Coulter ate in silence, his eyes on his plate. But when he was finished, he pushed back his chair and looked at Mira. "That was good," he said simply. Mira felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Thank you." "You know how to handle laundry?" "Yes." "Mending?" "Yes." "Good." He stood, reaching for his hat. "I've got work to do. Boys are coming with me. Liddy stays here. You'll be all right?" Mira nodded. "Yes." He studied her for a moment, then nodded and turned to the door. "Come on, boys." Noah and Cal scrambled after him, and the house fell quiet except for the sound of Liddy humming and the clink of dishes as Mira began to clear the table. This was her life now. And for the first time in a long time, Mira thought maybe, just maybe, she could do this. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm Mira had never known before. A rhythm built not on fear or survival, but on something steadier, something that felt almost like purpose. She woke before dawn each morning when the sky was still bruised purple, and the ranch lay quiet beneath a blanket of mist. She dressed quickly in the dim light of her small room, pulling on the same brown calico dress, now washed and mended at the hem, and made her way downstairs to start the fire in the kitchen stove. By the time Coulter and the boys came down, the house would be warm and the smell of coffee would fill the air like a promise. Breakfast became her first victory. Real eggs, not charred. Biscuits that rose instead of sitting like stones on the plate. Bacon fried crisp and sausage gravy thick enough to coat a spoon. She watched the way Noah's shoulders relaxed when he sat down to a hot meal. The way Cal ate with both hands like he couldn't get the food in fast enough. The way Liddy smiled at her over the rim of her milk cup. And Coulter. Coulter said little, but she noticed the way he paused before taking his first bite, as if he'd forgotten what good food tasted like. Noticed the way he sometimes looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite name. After breakfast, the men would leave, Coulter and the boys heading out to mend fences, check on cattle, repair equipment that had broken during the summer. Liddy would stay behind, trailing after Mira like a small, determined shadow. "Can I help?" she'd ask every morning, her blue eyes wide and hopeful. And every morning Mira would find her something to do. gathering eggs from the henhouse, sweeping the porch, folding cloths that didn't need folding, small tasks that made the little girl feel useful, that kept her hands busy and her smile bright. The house itself was a battleground of neglect. Not filth, Coulter had clearly tried, but the kind of weariness that came from a place that had stopped being a home and become simply a shelter. Dust gathered in corners no one thought to check. Curtains hung crooked on bent rods. The pantry was a disaster of half-empty jars and forgotten supplies shoved to the back of shelves. Mira attacked it all with a ferocity that surprised even her. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached and her hands were raw. She washed windows until light poured through them clean and unfiltered. She took down every curtain in the house, mended the tiers, washed away years of dust, and hung them back up straight. She reorganized the pantry, throwing out anything spoiled or stale, making lists of what they needed from town. And she learned. God, how she learned. Laundry was an ordeal. The washboard and tub sat out behind the house near the pump, and the first time Mira tried to tackle a week's worth of clothes and linens, she thought her arms might fall off. She scrubbed until her shoulders screamed, wrung out heavy fabric until her hands cramped, hung everything on the line to dry in the wind. By the time she was finished, the sun was high and her back was on fire. But when Coulter came in that evening and found clean shirts hanging in his room, he paused in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all that today," he said quietly. Mira, stirring a pot of stew at the stove, glanced back at him. "I wanted to earn my keep. You already are." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and turned back to the stew. But that night, when she climbed the stairs to her small room, she found a new bar of soap on her wash basin. The good kind, the kind that smelled like lavender instead of lye. She picked it up, her throat tight, and held it for a long moment before setting it carefully back down. Small gestures. Quiet acknowledgments, a language neither of them knew how to speak aloud. The children were harder to win over. Liddy had taken to Mira almost immediately, with the easy trust of a 6-year-old who'd been starving for a mother's touch. She followed Mira everywhere, chattering about her doll and the chickens and the kittens in the barn. She climbed into Mira's lap during the quiet afternoon hours and fell asleep there, her small body warm and solid and trusting. Cal was wary, but curious. At 9 years old, he had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, eyes that watched Mira carefully, measuring her against some invisible standard. But he was a child, and children could be won with patience and food and the kind of attention that said, "I see you." Mira learned that he loved horses, loved them with the kind of fierce, uncomplicated passion that only children could manage. So she started asking him about them, what their names were, which ones were fastest, which ones were stubborn. And slowly, carefully, he started to answer. One afternoon, he appeared in the kitchen doorway holding something wrapped in a cloth. "Made this," he mumbled, not quite meeting her eyes. Mira wiped her hands on her apron and took it, unfolding the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden bird, carved with a child's unsteady hand but recognizable. A sparrow, maybe, or a wren. The wings were crooked and the beak was too long, but it was beautiful in the way all earnest things are beautiful. "Cal," she said softly, "this is wonderful." He shrugged, his cheeks flushing. "It's not very good." "It's perfect." She set it carefully on the windowsill above the sink where the light caught it. "I'll keep it right here." He ducked his head, but she saw the smile before he turned and bolted out the door. Noah was different. Noah was 12, old enough to remember his mother clearly, old enough to resent anyone who tried to take her place. He was polite to Mira, always polite. But there was a wall between them, thick and high and deliberately maintained. He didn't talk to her unless necessary, didn't smile, didn't ask for anything. But he watched, always watching, his dark eyes measuring, judging, waiting for her to fail. Mira didn't push. She simply existed. She cooked his meals and washed his clothes and made sure his bedroom had clean linens. She asked him questions and didn't mind when his answers were short. She praised his work when Coulter mentioned he'd done well mending a fence or handling a difficult horse. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, the wall began to crack. It started small. Noah began clearing his plate after meals without being asked. He held the door open for her when her arms were full of laundry. He stopped leaving his boots in the middle of the floor, where she'd trip over them. Then one evening, as Mira was sweeping the porch, Noah appeared beside her. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing. Mira looked at the corner where dust had gathered. "So I did. Thank you." He picked up the second broom, the one Coulter used, and started sweeping the other end of the porch. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scratch of bristles on wood and the distant lowing of cattle. "My ma used to sweep twice a day," Noah said suddenly. "Said dirt didn't respect a house that didn't respect itself." Mira's hands stilled on the broom. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." His voice was flat, carefully controlled. "She died of fever. 2 years ago, almost to the day." "I'm sorry," Mira said quietly. Noah shrugged, but his shoulders were tense. "Pa did his best after, but he doesn't know how to make it feel like home anymore. Neither do we." Mira looked at the boy beside her. This child trying so hard to be a man, carrying burdens no 12-year-old should have to carry. "I'm not trying to replace her," she said softly. "I couldn't even if I wanted to, but I can try to make things easier, if you'll let me." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and certain. "Okay." And he went back to sweeping. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The work on the ranch was endless. There was always something that needed doing, always a fence that needed mending, a horse that needed shoeing, a steer that had wandered too far and needed bringing back. Coulter worked from dawn until well past dark most days, his body moving with the kind of steady, relentless determination that came from years of practice. He didn't complain, didn't slow down, but Mira saw the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders when he came in for supper, the way he moved just a little more carefully each evening, the lines deepening around his eyes. One night she found him sitting on the porch steps long after the children had gone to bed, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. She almost turned back inside, almost left him to his solitude. But something made her step outside instead, the screen door creaking softly behind her. Coulter looked up, startled, then settled back into stillness. "Didn't mean to disturb you," Mira said quietly. "You didn't." He shifted slightly, making room on the step beside him. "Can't sleep?" "Not yet." She sat down, careful to leave space between them, and folded her hands in her lap. "It's peaceful out here at night." "It is." He was silent for a moment, his gaze on the dark shapes of the mountains against the starlit sky. "Used to sit out here with my wife, after the kids were asleep. Just sit, talk about the day, make plans for tomorrow." Mira's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. I'll leave you to—" "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "Stay, if you want." So she stayed. They sat in silence for a while, the night air cool and clean, crickets singing in the grass. Finally, Coulter spoke again. "You're good with them, the children." "They're easy to be good to," Mira said softly. "They haven't been easy for a long time." He turned his head slightly, looking at her. Liddy barely spoke for 6 months after her mother died. Noah stopped smiling. Cal stopped eating unless we forced him. I didn't know how to help them, didn't know how to help myself. "You kept them alive," Mira said. "You kept this place running. That's more than most could do." "Surviving isn't the same as living." His voice was rough, edged with something raw. "I look at them sometimes and I see her, Sarah. The way Liddy tilts her head, the way Cal laughs, when he laughs. And it hurts so much I can't breathe. But then I feel guilty for hurting because they need me to be strong. And I don't know how to be both." Mira didn't know what to say, didn't have words for grief this deep, this complicated. So she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the step between them. Coulter went very still. Then, slowly, his fingers curled around hers, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being here, for everything." "You gave me a life when I had none," Mira whispered. "I'm the one who should be thanking you." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, two broken people holding each other up beneath a sky full of stars. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened into the kind of gold and crimson beauty that made Mira's heart ache. The aspens turned brilliant yellow, their leaves trembling in the wind like coins. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and earth and the promise of winter. Mira settled into the rhythms of the ranch like she'd been born to them. She learned which chickens were broody and which ones laid best. She learned how to work the butter churn without ending up with a sore arm and nothing to show for it. She learned the names of all the horses, Sable and Dusty, and the big bay mare called Temperance, who had a mean streak and a soft spot for apples. She learned Coulter's moods, too. The way he went quiet when the work was overwhelming, the way his jaw tightened when he was worried about money or weather or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong on a ranch. She learned to read the tension in his shoulders, to know when to offer help and when to simply make sure there was hot coffee waiting when he came inside. And she learned the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, when she was hanging laundry or kneading bread or reading to Liddy by the fire. A look she couldn't quite name but felt all the way through her bones. One afternoon in late October, Mira was in the kitchen peeling apples for a pie when Liddy appeared at her elbow. "Can I help?" the little girl asked, her eyes bright with hope. Of course. Mira handed her a small knife, dull enough to be safe, and showed her how to hold the apple, how to work the blade in careful circles. Liddy's tongue poked out in concentration as she worked, her small hands careful and determined. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, the pile of peeled apples growing slowly. Then Liddy looked up at Mira with those wide blue eyes. "Are you going to stay forever?" she asked. Mira's hands stilled. I don't know, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" "Because I want you to." Liddy set down her apple and knife and climbed into Mira's lap, wrapping her small arms around her neck. "I like having you here. You make Daddy smile again, and Noah doesn't get so sad anymore. And Cal talks now." Mira's throat closed up entirely. She wrapped her arms around the little girl and held her close, burying her face in those blonde braids that smelled like sunshine and soap. "I like being here," she whispered, "more than I can say." "Then stay," Liddy said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. If only it were. Because Mira had started to hear the whispers. It started in town during the rare trips she made with Coulter to pick up supplies. She'd walk into Hutchins' general store and the conversation would stop. Women would turn away, their faces carefully blank. Men would nod politely, but their eyes would slide past her like she wasn't quite real. She heard the words, though, heard them in fragments, in the spaces between false smiles. "Living in his house so soon after Sarah must be convenient for her. It's that kind of girl." Mira kept her head high and her face calm, but the words burrowed under her skin like splinters. One afternoon, as she was waiting by the wagon while Coulter settled the account inside, a woman approached her. Mrs. Helena Pritchard, wife of the town's dry goods merchant, dressed in black silk despite the dust and heat. "Miss Langley," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I was so surprised to hear you'd taken up residence at the Reeves Ranch." "Mrs. Pritchard," Mira replied evenly, "I'm working there, yes." "Working?" The woman's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "How industrious of you. Though I must say it does raise questions about propriety. A young woman, unmarried, living under the same roof as a widower and his children. People do talk." Mira's hands clenched in the folds of her skirt. "I'm sure they do. But Mr. Reeves saved me from a situation far worse than gossip, and I'm grateful for the work." "Of course you are." Mrs. Pritchard leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you must understand how it looks, dear. A girl with no family, no prospects, suddenly living in one of the largest ranches in the territory. Some might say you're taking advantage." "And some might mind their own business," Mira said quietly, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. Mrs. Pritchard's face flushed. "Well, I was only trying to offer friendly advice." "I didn't ask for it." The woman drew herself up, offended, and swept away in a rustle of skirts. Mira stood trembling by the wagon, her heart pounding, Her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. When Coulter emerged from the store a few minutes later, he took one look at her face and frowned. "What happened?" "Nothing," Mira said quickly. "Just town gossip." His jaw tightened. "What did they say?" "It doesn't matter." "Mira." He set down the crate of supplies he was carrying and turned to face her fully. "What did they say?" She met his eyes, saw the genuine concern there, and felt something crack inside her chest. "They said I'm taking advantage of you, that it's improper for me to live in your house, that people are talking." Coulter's expression went cold. "Let them talk." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." He picked up the crate and loaded it into the wagon with more force than necessary. "You work harder than anyone I've ever seen. You've brought life back into that house. My children smile again. If people want to gossip, that's their problem, not ours." "But it affects you," Mira said softly. "And the children. I don't want to bring shame to your family." Coulter stopped, his hands gripping the edge of the wagon, his knuckles white. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "The only shame in my life was watching my wife die and not being able to stop it. Everything else is just noise." He climbed onto the driver's bench and held out his hand to help Mira up. She took it, his grip strong and steady, and settled beside him. They rode in silence for a long while, the wagon creaking beneath them, the horses' hooves rhythmic on the packed dirt road. Finally, as the ranch came into view in the distance, Coulter spoke again. "You're not a burden, Mira. Don't let anyone make you feel like one." But late that night, lying alone in her small room, Mira couldn't stop hearing Mrs. Pritchard's voice. Couldn't stop wondering if the woman was right, if she was taking something she hadn't earned, if her presence here was doing more harm than good. She pressed her face into her pillow and let herself cry, quiet, careful tears that no one would hear. Downstairs, Coulter sat at the kitchen table, unable to sleep, staring at the wooden bird on the windowsill, and thinking about the woman upstairs who'd somehow become essential to his family's survival, and wondering when exactly he'd started thinking of her as more than just someone who worked for him. When exactly he'd started thinking of her as someone he might not be able to live without. The first snow came in early November, light and tentative, dusting the valley in white that melted by noon. But it was a warning. Winter was coming, and winter on a ranch meant preparation, meant hard work, meant hoping you'd done enough to survive until spring. Mira threw herself into the work with renewed determination. She helped Coulter and the boys move firewood from the pile near the barn to the covered porch, stacking it neatly where it would stay dry. She checked every window for drafts, stuffing rags into cracks and gaps. She inventoried the pantry and made lists of what they'd need to lay in before the roads became impassable. And she watched the family around her begin to heal in ways she hadn't quite noticed until now. Cal laughed more. Real laughter, bright and uncomplicated. He'd started carving more animals, leaving them around the house like gifts. A horse on Coulter's nightstand, a cat on Noah's pillow, a rabbit on Mira's wash basin. Noah had begun helping her in the kitchen after supper, drying dishes while she washed, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. He told her about school, about the books he loved, about his dreams of maybe leaving the ranch someday, not because he didn't love it, but because he wanted to see what else the world held. "Ma wanted me to go to college," he said one evening, his voice quiet. "Said I was smart enough, but after she died, it didn't seem important anymore." "It's still important," Mira said gently. "Your mother would want you to dream." Noah was silent for a moment, then, "Do you think she'd like you? If she was here?" Mira's hand stilled in the dishwater. "I don't know. I hope so." "I think she would," Noah said. "I think she'd be glad you're here, taking care of us. Taking care of Pa." He set down the towel and left before Mira could respond, but she stood at the sink for a long time after, tears streaming down her face, her heart too full for words. And Liddy, sweet, bright Liddy, had started calling her Mama when she was tired or excited or had forgotten to think about it first. The first time it happened, Mira had frozen, uncertain what to do. But Coulter had simply looked at his daughter and said, "Mira's not your mama, Liddy. Your mama's in heaven." "I know," Liddy had said seriously, "but can I have two? One in heaven and one here?" Coulter had looked at Mira then, his pale blue eyes unreadable. That's up to Mira. And Mira, her throat too tight to speak, had simply nodded. The house itself had transformed. It wasn't just clean now, it was warm. The kind of warm that had nothing to do with the fire and the hearth, and everything to do with the laughter that filled it. The conversations over meals, the way the children ran through the rooms without fear. One evening, as Mira was mending a shirt by lamplight, and the children were settled around the fire, Cal carving, Noah reading, Liddy playing with her doll, Coulter came and sat beside her. This, he said quietly, gesturing to the scene before them. This is what I'd forgotten was possible. Mira looked up from her sewing. What do you mean? Peace. His voice was rough. I'd forgotten what it felt like. For so long, this house was just a place where we existed, where we survived. But now, he trailed off, his jaw working. Now it feels like home again. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she set down her sewing. Coulter, I know I'm not good with words, he continued, his eyes on the fire. Sarah used to say I could talk to horses better than people. But I need you to know, what you've done here, for us, it's... He stopped, frustrated, searching for language that wouldn't come. You don't have to say anything, Mira said softly. I know. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, something that made Mira's breath catch, and her heart stutter in her chest. But then Liddy called out asking for help with her doll's dress, and the moment broke. Coulter stood, touching Mira's shoulder briefly, just a light pressure, there and gone, before crossing to his daughter. And Mira sat frozen, her skin burning where his hand had been, wondering if she'd imagined the look in his eyes, wondering what it meant if she hadn't. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late November, when frost still glittered on the grass and the sky hung low and gray with the promise of more snow. Mira was in the kitchen kneading bread dough, her hands working the mixture with practiced efficiency, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Not the familiar rhythm of Coulter and the boys returning from the pastures, but something different, multiple riders, moving fast. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, her stomach tightening with an instinct she'd learned to trust, back in the days when survival meant reading danger before it announced itself. 3 men on horseback were riding up the path to the house. The one in front sat tall in his saddle, his coat dusty and worn, his hat pulled low. But even from a distance, even after all these months, Mira recognized the set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried himself. Braden Cole. The name hit her like a fist to the chest, stealing her breath, making her hand shake against the windowsill. Braden Cole, who'd worked the mines with her father. Braden Cole, who'd loaned her father money for whiskey when the banks wouldn't. Braden Cole, who'd shown up at their shack 3 days before Samuel Porter had, his smile too wide and his intentions too clear. Your daddy owed me $30, girl, he'd said, standing in her doorway while she'd tried to hold it shut against him. But I'm a reasonable man. We can work out other arrangements. She'd locked the door that night and every night after, sleeping with a knife under her pillow, until Porter had tied her to that fence and Coulter had cut her free. And now Braden was here. Liddy, Mira said quietly, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Go upstairs to your room. Don't come down until I say. The little girl looked up from where she was playing with her doll on the floor, her eyes going wide at something in Mira's tone. Why? Please, sweetheart, right now. Liddy scrambled to her feet and ran for the stairs, her small footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Mira moved to the door and stepped out onto the porch, just as the 3 riders came to a stop in front of the house. Braden dismounted slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on her the entire time. He was older than she remembered, maybe 40, with graying hair and a face that had been handsome once but now just looked hard and mean. The 2 men with him were younger, rougher, the kind of hired guns you could find in any saloon if you had the money and the lack of conscience. Well, well, Braden said, his voice carrying that same false charm she remembered. Little Mira Langley, thought I'd lost you when Porter put you on display in Wolf Hollow. Imagine my surprise when I heard you'd ended up here, playing house with the rich rancher. Mira kept her voice steady, her hands hidden in the folds of her apron where he couldn't see them shaking. Mr. Cole, you're trespassing. I suggest you leave. Trespassing? He laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. That's a big word for a girl who used to live in a shack that leaked when it rained, but I guess you've learned some manners since Reeves took you in. Tell me, what arrangement did you work out with him? Must have been real special for him to pay your daddy's debt to Porter. That debt was paid in full. I don't owe anyone anything. See, that's where you're wrong. Braden took a step forward, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Your daddy owed me $30 too. Money I loaned him in good faith. Money that's still owed, even if he's dead. So either you pay me what's due, or... He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator. Or we revisit those other arrangements I mentioned. I don't have $30. No, but your rancher does. Seems to me he's got plenty. So you ask him real nice, or I'll ask him myself. Mr. Reeves isn't here, Mira said, lifting her chin even as fear coiled tight in her gut. And when he returns, I'm sure he'll have the sheriff with him to escort you off his property. Braden's smile widened. You always did have spirit. Your daddy used to talk about that, how you'd fight him when he came home drunk. Said you were too smart for your own good. He leaned against the porch rail, casual, confident. But here's the thing, Mira. I've been patient, real patient, waiting for the right time. And it seems to me that time is now. One of the men behind him, a thin, scarred man with nervous hands, shifted in his saddle. Boss, maybe we should... Shut up, Pike, Braden said without turning around. The lady and I are having a conversation. But there's no conversation to have, Mira said firmly. You need to leave. Now. Or what? Braden pushed off the rail and took another step forward, close enough now that Mira could smell the whiskey on his breath. You gonna make me? You and what army? That rancher's out in the fields with his boys, and you're here all alone except for that little blonde girl I saw running upstairs. Cute kid. Wonder how much Reeves would pay to keep her safe. The threat hung in the air like poison. Mira's hand moved instinctively to her apron pocket, where she'd started carrying a small kitchen knife after the whispers in town had grown sharper. Her fingers closed around the handle. Touch her, Mira said quietly, her voice dropping to something cold and deadly. And I'll kill you myself. Braden laughed again. There's that spirit. But you're outnumbered, girl, 3-1, and we're not leaving without either money or... The sound of horses approaching cut him off mid-sentence. Everyone turned as Coulter and the boys came riding up fast, alerted by one of the ranch hands who'd seen the strangers approaching. Coulter pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch, his hand resting on the rifle strapped to his saddle, his pale blue eyes assessing the situation in an instant. Noah and Cal reined in behind him, both boys tense and watchful. Gentlemen, Coulter said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority, you're on my land without invitation. State your business or leave. Braden turned to face him, that same easy confidence never wavering. Coulter Reeves. Heard a lot about you. Big rancher, rich man who likes to play hero. He gestured toward Mira. This girl's daddy owed me $30. I'm here to collect. Miss Langley's debts were paid, Coulter said evenly. By me. To Samuel Porter. If you have an issue with that, take it up with him. Porter's debt, sure, but not mine. I loaned Thomas Langley money before Porter ever did, money that's still owed. You have proof of this loan? Braden's smile flickered. A man's word is his proof. Not on my ranch, it isn't. Coulter dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the porch. He positioned himself between Braden and Mira, his body a solid wall. You have paperwork. Bring it to town. We'll settle it proper through the bank and the law. But you don't come to my home and threaten my household. We clear? Your household. Braden's eyes flicked to Mira, then back to Coulter. That what she is now? Part of your household? Heard she's more than just the help. Heard she's keeping your bed warm at night. The change in Coulter was instant and terrifying. One moment he was still, controlled. The next, his fist connected with Braden's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Braden stumbled back, blood spraying from his split lip, and the two men behind him reached for their guns. Don't! Coulter's voice was steel. His hand had moved to his own revolver, faster than Mira had known he could move, and it was aimed steady at the scarred man called Pike. You draw those weapons, and this gets ugly real fast. Your friend here insulted a lady under my protection. He's lucky I stopped at one punch." Braden spat blood into the dirt, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're going to regret that, Reeves." "Get off my land," Coulter said quietly. "All three of you. And if I see you anywhere near this ranch again, I won't be stopping at punches." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched tight as a wire, one wrong word away from snapping. Then Braden wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and smiled, a terrible smile full of promises and threats. "This ain't over. Not by a long shot." He climbed back onto his horse, his movements stiff with rage, and jerked the reins hard enough to make the animal dance sideways. The other two men followed, and together they rode back down the path toward the road. But Braden turned in his saddle one last time, his eyes finding Mira's. "I'll be seeing you, girl, real soon." Then they were gone, disappearing into the gray morning, leaving nothing but tension and the metallic taste of violence in the air. Coulter holstered his gun and turned to Mira, his face tight with concern. "Are you all right? Did he touch you?" "No," Mira managed, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "No, he just talked, threatened. But Coulter, he mentioned Liddy." "I heard." Coulter's jaw clenched. "Noah, Cal, go check the barn and the outbuildings. Make sure they didn't leave anyone behind. Then find Ben and the other hands. Tell them to keep watch. Anyone sees those men again, they come get me immediately." The boys nodded and took off at a run, their faces pale but determined. Coulter climbed the porch steps and stood in front of Mira, his hands hovering near her arms, but not quite touching, like he wasn't sure he had the right. "Mira, I need you to tell me everything. Who is that man?" So she did. Standing there in the cold morning air, her voice breaking more than once, she told him about Braden Cole and the loan and the threats and the arrangements he'd suggested, about the fear that had kept her locked in her shack those final days before Porter had claimed her. By the time she finished, Coulter's face had gone hard as granite. "He's not getting near you," he said quietly, "or the children. I promise you that." "Coulter, maybe I should leave?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost harsh. He took a breath, visibly forcing himself to calm. "No, you're not leaving. This is your home. Those men don't get to drive you away." "But if I wasn't here, they wouldn't have any reason to." "They'd find another reason. Men like that always do." His hands finally made contact, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "You stay, Mira. We'll handle this together." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true. That night, Coulter posted guards around the ranch and moved the children's bedrooms to the same floor as his and Mira's, clustering them together for safety. He gave Mira a loaded rifle and showed her how to use it, his hand steady over hers as he explained the mechanics. "I don't think they'll come tonight," he said quietly. "Men like Cole. They like to plan, to make you sweat. But if they do, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand?" Mira nodded, the weight of the rifle foreign and frightening in her hands. "Good." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "Get some sleep. I'll be right downstairs if you need me." But sleep wouldn't come. Mira lay in her narrow bed, the rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Every creak was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a whisper of danger. Somewhere around midnight she heard soft footsteps in the hall outside her door. "Mira?" Liddy's small voice trembling and scared. Mira was out of bed in seconds, opening the door to find the little girl standing there in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face. "I had a bad dream," Liddy whispered. "About the mean man. About him taking me away." "Oh, sweetheart." Mira scooped her up and carried her to the bed, wrapping them both in the quilt. "No one's taking you anywhere. Your daddy won't let that happen. I won't let that happen. Promise?" "I promise." Liddy curled against her, small and trusting, and eventually her breathing evened out into sleep. Mira held her close and stared at the ceiling, making silent vows to whatever God might be listening. She would die before she let Braden Cole hurt this child. The next 3 days passed in tense, watchful silence. The ranch hands took turns standing guard. Coulter kept the boys close, teaching them to shoot better, to watch for signs of trouble. Mira kept Liddy inside, occupying her with baking and sewing and stories, anything to keep her mind off the fear. But the fear was there, hovering like smoke, poisoning everything. On the fourth day, it was Cal who spotted the smoke first. He'd been out in the east pasture with his father and Noah, checking on a section of fence that had come loose during the last windstorm. He'd climbed up on a rock outcropping to get a better view, and that's when he saw it, thick black smoke rising from the direction of the barn. "Pa!" he'd screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" They ran, all three of them, running full out across the fields, Coulter's heart hammering against his ribs with a fear that had nothing to do with property and everything to do with the fact that Mira and Liddy were back at the house. And if someone had set the barn on fire, what else might they have done? The barn was fully engulfed by the time they reached it, flames roaring 20 feet high, the heat so intense they couldn't get within 30 yards. Coulter could hear the horses screaming inside, trapped, panicking, dying. And then he saw Mira. She was running toward the barn from the house, her skirts hiked up, her hair streaming behind her, her face set in lines of desperate determination. "Mira, no!" Coulter roared, but she was already at the barn doors, already throwing them open despite the wall of heat and smoke that rolled out. "The horses!" she screamed back. "They're trapped!" She disappeared inside before he could reach her. Coulter's blood turned to ice. He ran toward the barn, dimly aware of Noah and Cal shouting behind him, aware of ranch hands running from all directions with buckets and blankets, but all he could think was that Mira was inside that inferno, and he was about to lose her the same way he'd lost Sarah, to something he couldn't fight or fix or stop. Inside the barn, Mira couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The smoke was so thick it was like trying to move through water, and the heat was unbearable, searing her skin even through her dress. But she could hear the horses. God, their screams would haunt her forever. And she knew their stalls were at the back. She felt her way along the wall, coughing so hard she thought her lungs would tear, her eyes streaming. The first stall, Sable, the black gelding, she threw open the door and slapped him hard on the rump, driving him toward where she thought the entrance was. He bolted, nearly trampling her, but she was already moving to the next stall, Dusty, Temperance, the bay mare with the new foal. She freed them all, one by one, her hands blistering on the hot metal latches, her vision going dark around the edges. The last horse was out, and she turned to follow, but that's when she heard it, a terrible creaking groan from above. She looked up just in time to see the roof beam directly overhead begin to buckle. Then someone slammed into her from behind, driving her forward and down, and the beam crashed to the ground exactly where she'd been standing seconds before, sending up a shower of sparks and flame. Coulter. It was Coulter, his body covering hers, his arms wrapped around her head protectively as the barn tried to kill them both. "Move!" he roared in her ear, and together they scrambled toward the entrance, half crawling, half running through the smoke and heat. Behind them, another beam fell, and then another, the whole structure collapsing in on itself like a dying beast. They burst out into the open air and kept moving, kept running until they were far enough away that the heat wasn't scorching their skin. Coulter pulled Mira down to the ground and knelt over her, his hands frantically checking her for injuries, his face black with soot and twisted with fear. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice rough and furious. "You could have died. You almost died." Mira was coughing too hard to answer, her whole body shaking, her hands bloody and blistered. But she'd gotten the horses out, all of them. She could see them milling around the yard, terrified but alive. "The children," she managed to gasp. "Where?" "Liddy's inside with Ben's wife. Noah and Cal are over there." He pointed to where the boys stood at a safe distance, their faces pale with shock. "Everyone's safe. Everyone except you, because you ran into a burning building like a goddamn fool. The horses are not worth your life." He was shaking now, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes blazing with something that went beyond fear into territory neither of them knew how to name. "Nothing is worth your life, do you understand me? Nothing." Mira stared at him, her breath catching, and realized with sudden, startling clarity that he wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Terrified in the way people were when they were about to lose something irreplaceable. Before she could process that thought, one of the ranch hands shouted a warning. "Riders! 3 of them coming fast from the north!" Coulter's head snapped up, and Mira saw his expression shift from fear to something cold and deadly. He pulled his revolver from his belt and stood, positioning himself between Mira and the approaching horsemen. Braden Cole and his 2 men rode into the yard at a gallop, pulling their horses to a stop just outside the ring of people fighting the fire. Braden surveyed the burning barn with satisfaction. Then his eyes found Mira on the ground, bleeding and covered in soot. "Hell of a fire," he called out, his voice carrying over the roar of flames. "Shame about your barn, Reeves. These things happen, though. Accidents." "That was no accident," Coulter said quietly, his gun aimed steady at Braden's chest. "You did this?" "Can't prove that." Braden smiled. "But I did warn you this wasn't over. Maybe now you'll take me seriously. Maybe now you'll pay what's owed." "The only thing I'm going to pay is a bullet if you don't leave right now." Braden's smile widened. "See, that's where you're wrong, because I brought some friends this time, and they're real interested in having a conversation with you about respect and debts and what happens to people who think they're too good to negotiate." The 2 men with him drew their weapons, and suddenly the situation exploded. One of Coulter's ranch hands fired first. Not to kill, but to warn, the shot kicking up dirt near Pike's horse. But Pike panicked and fired back, and then everyone was shooting, diving for cover, the air filling with the crack of gunfire and the screams of horses and people. Coulter grabbed Mira and pulled her behind a water trough, his body shielding hers as bullets struck wood and metal around them. She could see Noah and Cal taking cover behind the well, see ranch hands returning fire from positions around the yard. "Stay down," Coulter shouted, then raised his gun over the trough and fired 3 times in quick succession. One of Braden's men, the thin, scarred one, went down, clutching his shoulder. Pike's horse reared and threw him, and he scrambled for cover behind a wagon. But Braden stayed mounted, controlling his horse with one hand while firing with the other, his face twisted with rage. He was aiming not at Coulter, not at the ranch hands, but toward the house, toward where Liddy stood frozen in the doorway, too scared to move. "No!" Mira's scream tore from her throat as she saw Braden's gun turn toward the little girl. Without thinking, without hesitation, she threw herself up and ran, not away from the gunfire, but directly into it, directly toward Liddy. She reached the porch just as Braden fired. The bullet caught her in the left side, just below her ribs, spinning her around and dropping her to the ground like a stone. The pain was white-hot, absolute, stealing her breath and her vision in one terrible instant. But she'd done it. She'd put herself between Braden and Liddy, and the little girl was unharmed. Somewhere in the chaos, Coulter was roaring like a wounded animal. He vaulted over the trough and charged Braden, grabbed him by the leg and pulled him from his horse. They went down hard, fighting with fists and fury, and Coulter was beyond reason, beyond mercy, every ounce of fear and rage and helplessness pouring out in savage violence. He didn't stop until Braden was on the ground, disarmed, his face bloody, begging for mercy he didn't deserve. The other men had scattered. Pike was wounded and running. The scarred man was unconscious. The fight was over. But Coulter didn't care about any of that. He left Braden in the dirt and ran to where Mira lay on the porch, her blood soaking into the wood, her face white as death. "No, no, no," he was saying, over and over, his hands pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Mira. Stay with me, please." Liddy was crying, clinging to Mira's hand. Noah and Cal had run up, their faces stricken. Mira's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching for and finding Coulter's face above her. "The children," she whispered, blood on her lips. "Are they safe?" "They're safe," Coulter said, his voice breaking. "Because of you." "God, Mira, what did you do?" "Protected them." She managed something that might have been a smile. That's what you do, for family." Her eyes closed, and Coulter's world narrowed to the sound of his own voice, screaming for someone to get the doctor, screaming at Mira to stay awake, screaming at a God he'd stopped believing in to please not take her too. Not her, anyone but her. The doctor arrived 47 minutes later, though to Coulter it felt like 47 years. Every second that passed while he knelt on the porch, with Mira's blood soaking through his hands, was an eternity. Every shallow breath she took a gift he didn't deserve. He'd carried her inside, so carefully, like she was made of glass, and laid her on the kitchen table because it was longer and sturdier than any bed. Noah had run for blankets. Cal had pumped water until his arms shook. Liddy had stood in the corner, silent tears streaming down her face, clutching her doll so tight the fabric tore. And Coulter had pressed his hands against the wound and prayed with words he'd forgotten he knew. Doc Harrison was an old man, silver-haired and grim-faced, with hands that had seen every kind of injury the frontier could produce. He took one look at Mira, at the blood, at Coulter's face, and started barking orders. Boil water, clean cloth, lots of it, whiskey if you have it. And get these children out of here. This isn't something they need to see. Noah herded his siblings upstairs, though Liddy fought him, her small voice breaking as she called out for Mira. The sound of it nearly shattered Coulter, but he stayed rooted beside the table, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. You too, Reeves, Doc Harrison said, washing his hands in the basin Noah had filled. Unless you can keep steady. I'm staying. The doctor looked at him, really looked at him, and whatever he saw made him nod once. Then hold her down. This is going to hurt, and she's going to fight even unconscious. The next hour was the worst of Coulter's life, and he'd lived through his wife dying slowly of fever, through winters that killed half his herd, through a childhood that had beaten the softness out of him before he'd turned 12. But watching Doc Harrison dig the bullet out of Mira's side while she screamed and thrashed against Coulter's hold, watching her blood spill across the table in rivers, watching her go limp and silent in a way that made his heart stop. Nothing had prepared him for that. Got it, the doctor finally said, holding up the misshapen piece of lead with his forceps. Missed anything vital, thank God. But she's lost a lot of blood. Next few days will tell us if she's strong enough to pull through. She is, Coulter said hoarsely. She's the strongest person I know. Doc Harrison began stitching the wound closed, his movements precise and efficient. She'll need constant care, someone to watch her, change the bandages, keep her warm. Fever's going to come. Always does with wounds like this. When it does, you cool her down with wet cloths, get as much water in her as she'll take, and pray. That's about all you can do. I'll take care of her, Coulter said, whatever she needs. The doctor glanced at him, something knowing in his old eyes. I expect you will. By the time he finished and packed his bag, dawn was breaking. Doc Harrison left instructions and supplies, took the payment Coulter pressed into his hands without counting it, and climbed wearily into his wagon. Reeves, he said before snapping the reins, that girl threw herself in front of a bullet for your daughter. Don't know what arrangement you two have, but that's not something hired help does. That's something family does. Coulter didn't answer, couldn't answer. He just watched the wagon roll away, then turned and went back inside where Mira lay pale and still on the table they'd covered with clean sheets. He stood there for a long moment, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his throat so tight he could barely breathe. Then he bent and lifted her, so gently, so carefully, and carried her upstairs to his bedroom, the one with the largest bed and the window that caught the morning light. He'd slept on the floor if he had to, on the porch, in the goddamn barn ruins. But Mira was getting the best room, the softest bed, every comfort he could provide. Because Doc Harrison was right. What Mira had done, throwing herself between Braden's gun and Liddy, that wasn't duty. That wasn't obligation or repayment for a debt. That was love. And Coulter, who'd spent 2 years keeping everyone at arm's length, who'd convinced himself that he'd never feel anything again after Sarah died, had to face the terrifying truth that he loved her too. Had maybe loved her since that first day in Wolf Hollow, when she'd stood tied to a fence with her chin high and her eyes blazing with defiance. Had definitely loved her somewhere between watching her laugh with his children and seeing her hands shake as she learned to work the butter churn and listening to her read stories by firelight in that soft, musical voice that made the house feel like home again. He loved her. And he'd almost lost her before he'd found the courage to tell her. The fever came that night, just as Doc Harrison had predicted. Mira's body temperature spiked so high that Coulter could feel the heat radiating off her skin when he laid his hand on her forehead. She thrashed in the bed, tangling in the sheets, crying out words that made no sense. Her father's name, something about a fence, fragments of fear and memory. Coulter worked through the night, cooling her with wet cloths, dribbling water between her cracked lips, changing the bandages when blood seeped through. Noah and Cal took turns helping, bringing fresh water from the pump, holding her hand when she seemed to calm at their touch. Liddy refused to leave. She'd dragged her blanket and pillow into Coulter's room and made a nest in the corner, and nothing he said would convince her to go back to her own bed. "I need to be here when she wakes up," the little girl insisted, her bottom lip trembling. "So she knows I'm okay. So she knows she didn't get hurt for nothing." So Coulter let her stay. On the second night, Mira's fever broke just before midnight. Coulter was half dozing in the chair beside the bed when he felt her stir, felt her hand move beneath his where he'd been holding it. His eyes snapped open. "Mira?" She turned her head slightly, her eyes fluttering open. They were glazed with pain and confusion, but they were open. They were seeing him. "Coulter?" she whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "Where?" "You're home," he said quickly, leaning forward. "You're safe. The children are safe. Everyone's fine." "Liddy?" The fear in her voice, even weak as she was, made his chest ache. "Right here, sweetheart." He glanced at the corner where his daughter had finally fallen asleep. She wouldn't leave. None of them would. Mira's eyes closed again, but this time it was the natural exhaustion of healing, not the terrible stillness of unconsciousness. "Good," she breathed. "That's good." "You took a bullet," Coulter said, his voice rough. "You ran straight into gunfire. You could have died." "But I didn't." She managed to open her eyes again, meeting his gaze. "And Liddy's safe." "You're insane," he said, but there was no heat in it, only wonder and fear and something too big to name. "Completely insane." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Probably." He wanted to say so many things. Wanted to tell her that she'd terrified him, that watching her bleed on the porch had broken something inside him that he didn't know could break twice. Wanted to tell her that she was brave and foolish and perfect, and his, if she'd have him. But she was already slipping back into sleep, her body demanding rest it desperately needed, and the words stayed locked in his chest where they burned like embers. "Rest," he said instead, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'll be right here." And he was. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Coulter barely left Mira's side except when absolutely necessary. He'd assigned Ben, his most trusted ranch hand, to oversee the work while he played nurse, a role he'd learned with Sarah and had hoped never to perform again. But this was different. Sarah's illness had been slow and inevitable, a drowning he couldn't stop no matter how hard he fought. Mira's injury was sudden and violent, but it was also survivable. She was healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing. He changed her bandages twice a day, gritting his teeth against the way she tried not to cry out when he had to clean the wound. He helped her sip broth and water, supported her when she needed to sit up, read to her from the books Noah brought from the small shelf downstairs, dime novels and poetry, and even the Bible. Though Coulter stumbled over the verses, his voice uncertain with faith he'd lost long ago. And she listened, or pretended to, when she was too tired to keep her eyes open. And sometimes she'd reach for his hand and hold it while he read, her grip weak but steady. The children visited constantly. Noah would sit on the edge of the bed and tell her about the ranch work, about how they were already clearing the barn wreckage and planning to rebuild come spring. Cal brought his carvings, a whole menagerie now, and lined them up on the windowsill where Mira could see them when she woke. And Liddy simply crawled into bed beside her whenever Coulter's back was turned, curling against Mira's uninjured side and falling asleep there, her small hand clutching Mira's nightgown. "You're going to hurt her," Coulter warned one afternoon, trying to extract his daughter. "She's fine," Mira said softly, her arm coming around Liddy protectively. "Let her stay." So he did. On the 5th day, Mira was finally strong enough to sit up without help, though the effort left her pale and shaking. Coulter propped pillows behind her back and handed her a cup of tea, watching carefully as she wrapped both hands around it. "I need to tell you something," he said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "About what happened. After." Mira looked at him, waiting. "Sheriff came out," Coulter continued. "Arrested Braden Cole and what's left of his men. Cole's going to prison for attempted murder, arson, a list of charges long as my arm. He won't be bothering anyone again." Relief flooded Mira's face. "Good. But there's more." Coulter leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on his clasped hands. "While you were..." While you were unconscious, I did something, and I need to know if it's all right." Mira frowned. "What did you do?" He rose and crossed to the dresser, pulling out a folded piece of parchment from the top drawer. His hand shook slightly as he brought it back to the bed and held it out to her. "I had my lawyer draw this up, had him file it with the county. It's legal, binding. But if you don't want it, if it's too much, I can—" "Coulter." Mira set down her tea and took the parchment, unfolding it carefully. "What is this?" "Just read it." She did, her eyes moving over the careful script, and Coulter watched her face as understanding dawned, watched the way her breath caught, the way her fingers trembled against the paper, the way tears began to spill down her cheeks. It was a deed. The deed to the Reeves Ranch, all 1,500 acres, the house, the outbuildings, the livestock, everything. And on the line for ownership, 2 names were written in perfect legal script: Coulter Reeves and Mira Langley. Equal partners, equal owners. "I don't understand," Mira whispered, looking up at him with those dark eyes swimming in tears. "Why would you? I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not enough," Coulter said roughly. He knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level, and took her free hand in both of his. "Mira, you saved what I couldn't. You saved my children, my home, me. You brought life back to this place when I thought it was dead forever. You threw yourself in front of a bullet for my daughter without a second's hesitation. This ranch, this life, none of it means anything if you're not part of it. But don't." His grip tightened. "Don't say you're just anything. You're not just hired help. You're not just someone passing through. He struggled for words, his throat working. "You're family. You've been family since the day I brought you here. I just didn't know how to say it. Didn't know if I had the right." Mira was crying in earnest now, the parchment crumpling slightly in her grip. "Coulter, I can't take half your ranch." "Then take all of it," he said desperately. "Take the whole damn thing. I don't care. Just stay. Please. Stay here with us. With me." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mira's quiet sobs and the distant call of a hawk outside the window. Coulter knelt there, his heart hammering, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to tell him he was a fool, or that she couldn't, or that this was all too much, too fast. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and certain. "I don't want the ranch," she said. Coulter's heart sank. "Mira, I want you." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making the room tilt sideways. He stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard. Mira reached out and cupped his face with her free hand, her palm warm against his cheek. "I fell in love with you somewhere between learning to make decent biscuits and watching you read to your children by firelight. I fell in love with the way you fixed the porch rail without anyone asking, the way you left soap on my wash basin, the way you look at your kids like they're the only thing in the world that matters. I don't need land or deeds or legal papers. I just need you to tell me that what I feel, that it's not just me, that you feel it too." Coulter's vision blurred. He brought his hand up to cover hers where it rested against his face, and when he spoke, his voice broke on the words. "I love you," he said. "God help me, Mira. I love you so much it terrifies me. I thought I'd lost that. The ability to love someone that way. Thought Sarah took it with her when she died. But then you stood on that fence in Wolf Hollow looking like you'd fight the whole town if you had to, and something in my chest just woke up. And every day since, you've made it impossible not to love you more." "Coulter," she breathed, fresh tears spilling. "I don't have pretty words," he continued, the confession pouring out of him now like water through a broken dam. "I'm just a rancher. Just a man who's made more mistakes than he can count. But I swear to you, if you'll stay, if you'll let me, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. You and the children, you're my whole world, and I'm asking you to be part of it, not as hired help, not as someone who owes a debt, but as my partner, my equal, my—" He couldn't say the word, couldn't push that far, that fast, even though it burned in his chest begging to be spoken. But Mira said it for him. "Your wife?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and hopeful and terrifying. Coulter closed his eyes, overwhelmed, and pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I was going to work up to that. give you time to heal, court you proper. But yes, God, yes, marry me, Mira. Make this official. Make this family complete. I'm covered in bandages and can barely sit up without help, Mira said, but she was laughing through her tears now, the sound bright and incredulous. This is possibly the worst proposal in the history of proposals. Is that a no? That's a yes, you impossible man. She tugged at his hand until he looked up at her, and the smile on her face was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes to all of it. Coulter surged up and kissed her, careful of her injury, mindful of her pain, but unable to stop himself from needing that connection, that confirmation that this was real. Her lips were soft and warm beneath his, and she kissed him back with a tenderness that made his chest ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mira rested her forehead against his. "The children," she whispered. "What will they think?" "I think," came Noah's voice from the doorway, making them both jump, "that it's about damn time." Coulter turned to find all three of his children standing in the doorway. Noah, with his arms crossed and a rare smile on his face, Cal bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement, and Liddy with her hands clasped under her chin like she was watching a fairy tale come to life. "How long have you been standing there?" Coulter demanded, though his ears were burning. "Long enough," Noah said. He stepped into the room, his brothers and sister following. "Long enough to hear you finally say what we've all known for weeks." "You knew?" Mira asked, incredulous. "Everyone knew," Cal piped up. "You two look at each other like Daddy looked at Mama," Liddy finished softly. She climbed onto the bed and wrapped her arms around Mira's neck, careful of the bandages. "Does this mean you're staying forever? Does this mean you're going to be our mama?" Mira's eyes filled again as she held the little girl close. "If you'll have me." "Yes!" Liddy squeezed tighter. "Yes, yes, yes!" Cal let out a whoop and launched himself onto the bed too, and Noah followed more slowly but with genuine happiness on his face. They piled around Mira, careful of her wound but unable to contain their joy, and Coulter stood back and watched his family. This impossible, beautiful family that had been broken and was now somehow whole again. Mira looked up at him over the children's heads, her eyes shining, her smile tremulous but real. And Coulter smiled back, something he'd thought he'd forgotten how to do, and felt the last piece of his broken heart finally click back into place. Later, after the children had been shooed back to their own rooms and the house had settled into quiet, Coulter returned to find Mira still holding the deed, smoothing her fingers over their two names written side by side. "I meant what I said," he told her, settling into the chair beside the bed. "This ranch is as much yours as mine. More, maybe, since you're the one who made it feel like home again." "I can't believe you did this," Mira said softly. "When everyone in town calls me a burden, when they whisper that I'm taking advantage of you, then everyone in town is a fool." Coulter reached out and took her hand. "You're not a burden, Mira. You never were. You're a gift. One I don't deserve, but am grateful for every single day." "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That night when Braden came, when I saw him aiming at Liddy, I didn't think. I just moved." "I know." Coulter's throat tightened. "And I've never been so terrified in my life as when I saw you go down. Not even when Sarah—" He stopped, the old grief still there, but different now, softer somehow. "I thought I'd lost you before I ever had the chance to tell you what you meant to me." "You have me now," Mira said, squeezing his hand, "for as long as you want me." "Forever, then." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "That's how long I want you, forever." She smiled, that beautiful smile that lit up her whole face, and Coulter felt something in his chest expand until he thought it might burst. This was happiness. Real happiness. Not just the absence of pain, but the presence of joy. He'd thought he'd never feel it again. Thought that part of his life was over. But Mira had proved him wrong. Had walked into his life tied to a fence and bleeding, and somehow managed to save him just as surely as he'd saved her. They sat together in the quiet, hands clasped, watching the stars appear one by one outside the window. And for the first time in 2 years, Coulter Reeves allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. that the future might hold something worth living for after all. Spring came to the valley like a benediction, soft and green and impossibly gentle after the hard winter that had tested them all in ways they hadn't expected. The snow melted slowly, revealing earth that had slept beneath the cold, and with it came the kind of renewal that felt almost sacred. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground in defiant bursts of color, purple lupine and yellow balsam root and the delicate white of evening primrose. The aspens unfurled new leaves that shimmered silver green in the wind, and the creek that ran through the eastern pasture swelled with snowmelt, singing its ancient song. Mira stood on the newly rebuilt porch, one hand resting lightly on the rail that Coulter had replaced board by board through the winter months, and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The wound in her side was still tender when she moved wrong, still pulled when she stretched too far. But Doc Harrison had declared her healed enough to stop fussing over, which meant Coulter had finally stopped hovering quite so intensely. Though he still watched her. She could feel his eyes on her even now, from where he stood in the doorway behind her, could feel the weight of his concern and his love in equal measure. "You should be resting," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Mira smiled without turning around. "I've been resting for 4 months. If I rest any more, I'll forget how to move." Doc said I was healed. That's different from fragile." She glanced back at him over her shoulder, her smile softening. "I'm all right, Coulter. I promise." He crossed to her and slipped his arms around her waist from behind, careful as always of her left side, and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing in the morning air, watching the light spill gold across their land. Their land. Even after 4 months, the thought still made Mira's breath catch. "The barn's almost finished," Coulter said quietly. "Another week, maybe 2, and we'll be ready to bring the horses back from Ben's property." "It's beautiful," Mira said, looking at the structure rising from the ashes of the old one. "Better than before. Had good help." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Noah and Cal have been working like men twice their age. Even Liddy's been helping. She spent half of yesterday organizing nails by size in the tool shed. She takes after you, likes things orderly. She takes after you, likes feeling useful." Mira leaned back against him, letting his warmth and solidity anchor her. The winter had been hard, not just because of her injury, but because of everything that had come after. The gossip in town had reached a fever pitch when word spread that Coulter Reeves had made Mira Langley part owner of his ranch. The whispers had turned to outright accusations, the kind that would have destroyed a lesser woman. But Mira had learned something during those months of healing, something fundamental about her own strength. She'd learned that other people's opinions only had the power she gave them, that the truth of her life, the love she'd found, the family she'd become part of, the home she'd helped build, mattered more than 1,000 cruel tongues. Still, it had hurt, and it had taken Coulter's unwavering support and the children's fierce loyalty to remind her that she belonged here, that she'd earned her place not through manipulation, but through love and sacrifice, and the simple act of showing up every day ready to work and care and give everything she had. "I need to tell you something," Mira said, turning in his arms to face him. "About town, about the wedding, Coulter's jaw tightened. They'd been planning to marry in late spring, a simple ceremony at the ranch with just family and close friends. But every time they'd tried to set a date, something had come up. Mira's health, the barn reconstruction, a particularly brutal stretch of weather that had kept everyone focused on survival rather than celebration. "If you want to wait longer," he started. "No." Mira reached up and cupped his face, feeling the rasp of morning stubble against her palms. "I don't want to wait. I want to marry you. I want it to be official, legal, binding in every way that matters. But I also want to do it right." "Right how?" "I want to do it in town. At the church. With everyone watching." Coulter pulled back slightly, frowning. "Mira, after everything they've said about you..." "Exactly." Her voice was firm, certain. "I want them to see. I want them to watch me walk down that aisle and marry you with my head held high. I want them to know that their whispers didn't break me, that their cruelty didn't drive me away. I want them to see that I belong here, that I've earned this, and that no amount of gossip changes the truth. Coulter stared at her for a long moment, something like awe flickering in his pale blue eyes. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, deep and thorough and full of pride. "You," he said when they finally broke apart, "are the bravest person I've ever met." "I'm terrified," Mira admitted. "That's what makes it brave." So they set the date for the first Sunday in June, when the weather would be warm and the valley would be at its most beautiful. Mira sent word to Reverend Michaels, who agreed to perform the ceremony with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Coulter posted notice at the general store, making their intentions public and daring anyone to object. The responses were mixed. Some people, like Doc Harrison and Ben's wife Martha, were thrilled, offering congratulations and help with preparations. Others were conspicuously silent, their disapproval hanging in the air like smoke. And a few, like Helena Pritchard, were outright hostile. Mira encountered her in Hutchins' general store 3 weeks before the wedding, while she was purchasing fabric for a new dress. Mrs. Pritchard had swept in with her usual dramatic flair, taken one look at Mira, and gone rigid with offense. "Well," she'd said loudly enough for the entire store to hear, "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I must say it didn't take you long to secure your position, did it? From fence to fortune in less than a year. Quite the accomplishment." Mira had felt every eye in the store turn to her, had felt the old shame trying to rise up and choke her. But she'd thought about Coulter's arms around her on the porch, about Liddy calling her mama, about the deed with her name written in permanent ink, and she'd straightened her spine and met Mrs. Pritchard's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Reeves and I are getting married because we love each other," she'd said clearly. "Whatever story you've told yourself about how that came to be, it's just that, a story. The truth is much simpler and far less interesting. I'm sorry if that disappoints you." Mrs. Pritchard's face had gone purple. "How dare you?" "No!" Mira's voice had sharpened. "How dare you? You don't know me. You don't know what I've survived or what I've sacrificed. You don't know that I ran into a burning barn to save horses, or that I took a bullet meant for a child. You don't know anything except gossip and assumptions, and I'm done apologizing for having the audacity to be happy." She'd paid for her fabric, walked out with her head high, and only allowed herself to shake once she was safely in the wagon. But she'd done it. She'd stood up for herself, for her truth, and it had felt like winning a battle she hadn't known she was fighting. When she told Coulter about it that evening, he'd pulled her into his arms and held her like she was something precious. "I'm so proud of you," he'd whispered into her hair. "So damn proud." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Martha came out to the ranch to help Mira sew her dress, a simple cream-colored gown with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, nothing fancy but beautiful in its simplicity. The children threw themselves into decorating, Liddy picking wildflowers by the armful, Cal carving small wooden birds to place around the church, Noah practicing his role as best man with the kind of seriousness he brought to everything. And Coulter watched it all with an expression Mira had come to recognize, equal parts love and disbelief, like he still couldn't quite believe this was his life now, that happiness was allowed to exist in the space where grief had lived for so long. 2 days before the wedding, as they were finishing supper, Noah cleared his throat in the way that meant he had something important to say. "I've been thinking," he started, his eyes on his plate, "about Ma, about what she'd think of all this." The table went quiet. Liddy stopped swinging her legs. Cal set down his fork. Coulter went very still. "I think," Noah continued, lifting his gaze to meet Mira's, "that she'd be happy. Not because she's been replaced. Nobody could replace her. But because you make us happy. Because you take care of us the way she would have wanted. Because Pa smiles again. And that's something she'd want too." Mira's throat closed entirely. "Noah, I wanted you to know that," he said firmly, "before the wedding. So you know it's not just Pa choosing you, it's all of us. You're our family now. You have been for a while." "Since you saved the horses," Cal added solemnly. "That's when I knew." "Since you made good biscuits," Liddy said, which made everyone laugh even as tears streamed down Mira's face. Coulter reached across the table and took her hand, his grip strong and steady. "See," he said softly. "Told you that you belonged here." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Mira and Coulter sat on the porch steps under a sky full of stars. Mira leaned against his shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them lost in the comfortable silence that had become their language. "Are you nervous?" Coulter asked eventually. "About Sunday?" "Yes," Mira admitted, "but not about marrying you. Never about that. I'm nervous about walking into that church and seeing all those faces, about giving them another chance to judge me." "But they can judge all they want," Coulter said firmly. "Doesn't change what's true. Doesn't change us." "I know, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt sometimes. The things they say, the way they look at me like I'm something dirty they scraped off their boots." Coulter was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then, "Sarah used to say that people fear what they don't understand, and they try to destroy what they fear. You scare them, Mira, because you didn't play by their rules. You didn't accept the fate they assigned you. You fought and survived and built something better, and that makes them uncomfortable because it means they could too, if they had your courage. So they tear you down instead, try to make you small again so they don't have to look at their own limitations." Mira turned to look at him, surprised. Sarah said that? Among other things, she was wiser than me by half. He smiled slightly. "She would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated your spine." "I wish I could have known her." "Me too." Coulter pressed a kiss to her temple. "But I'm grateful for the time I had with her, and I'm grateful for the time I get with you. Both things can be true." Mira nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't before that love didn't diminish love, that honoring what came before didn't mean rejecting what came after. Sarah would always be part of this family, part of this land, part of the story. But Mira was writing the next chapter, and there was room for both truths to exist. "2 more days," she whispered. "2 more days," Coulter agreed, "and then you're mine. Legally, officially, irrevocably mine." "I've been yours since you cut those ropes," Mira said softly. "Everything else is just paperwork." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and pulled her closer. They sat like that until the moon rose high and silver, two people who'd been broken and lost finding their way home to each other. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that felt like a gift. Mira woke early, her stomach a tangle of nerves and excitement, and found Martha already in the kitchen brewing coffee and laying out breakfast. "Morning, bride," Martha said with a warm smile. "Ready for the biggest day of your life?" "I think so," Mira said, accepting the cup of coffee gratefully. "Ask me again in an hour." The house was already buzzing with activity. Liddy was racing through the rooms in her new dress, pale yellow with white ribbons, chattering about flowers and whether her hair should be braided or loose. Cal was attempting to tie his own necktie and making a spectacular mess of it. Noah was polishing his shoes with intense concentration, determined that everything would be perfect. And Coulter had disappeared early to Ben's place, driven off by Martha's insistence that it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. Mira had caught his reluctant gaze as he'd left, seen the promise there. "Just a few hours, and then I'm not leaving your side again." Martha helped Mira into her dress, fastening the tiny buttons up the back with practiced efficiency. The fabric settled around her like a whisper, and when Mira caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy. Not just acceptable or presentable, but genuinely, radiantly happy. "Beautiful," Martha declared, stepping back to admire her work. "Coulter's going to swallow his tongue when he sees you." "That's not very romantic," Mira said, but she was smiling. "It's honest. Come on, let's get you to that church before you lose your nerve." The ride into Wolf Hollow felt both endless and far too short. Mira sat in the wagon between Martha and Doc Harrison, who'd volunteered to walk her down the aisle in lieu of the father she no longer had. The children rode in the back, Liddy clutching her basket of wildflowers, the boys unusually quiet and serious in their Sunday best. As they rolled into town, Mira saw people stopping on the sidewalks to watch. Some smiled, some whispered, some turned away. But Mira kept her eyes forward, her chin high, her hands folded calmly in her lap, even though they wanted to shake. The church stood at the end of Main Street, white paint gleaming in the sunshine, its bell tower reaching toward the endless blue sky. Wagons and horses filled the area around it, more than Mira had expected, more than seemed possible for a wedding that half the town had condemned. "Looks like you've got quite an audience," Doc Harrison said dryly. "Hope you're ready for them." "I am," Mira said, and meant it. They pulled up in front of the church, and Doc helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy. Martha gathered the children, fussing over their appearances one last time. Then they were climbing the steps, entering the cool dimness of the sanctuary, and Mira's breath caught. The church was full. Every pew was occupied, faces turning to watch as she appeared in the doorway. She recognized some of them, shopkeepers and ranchers, their wives and children, people she'd seen in passing during her months in Wolf Hollow. Some looked curious, some looked skeptical, and some, like Helena Pritchard sitting ramrod straight in the third row, looked openly disapproving. But Mira barely saw any of them, because Coulter was standing at the front of the church beside Reverend Michaels, and the moment his eyes found hers, the rest of the world fell away. He was wearing a black suit she'd never seen before, his hair combed back, his face clean-shaven. But it was the expression on his face that made her heart stutter, pure, unfiltered love and awe, maapam, and something that looked almost like worship. The organ began to play, and Doc Harrison offered her his arm. "Ready?" he whispered. Mira nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. They started down the aisle, slow and measured, and Mira kept her eyes on Coulter. Watched his throat work as he swallowed hard. Watched the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from running to meet her halfway. She passed Helena Pritchard, who was staring at her with narrowed eyes. Past Samuel Porter, who'd shown up out of morbid curiosity. Past all the people who'd whispered and judged and condemned her. And she didn't care. Didn't care about any of them. Because Coulter was waiting for her at the end of that aisle, and he was looking at her like she'd hung the moon in stars, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd forgotten how to say. When they finally reached the front of the church, Doc Harrison placed her hand in Coulter's with gentle ceremony. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "She's something special." "I know," Coulter replied, his voice rough. "I will." Reverend Michaels cleared his throat and began the ceremony. Mira heard the words, the traditional vows, the promises, the blessings, but they felt distant, unimportant compared to the way Coulter was holding her hands, the way his thumbs stroked over her knuckles, the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the entire world. "Do you, Coulter James Reeves, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do." Firm, certain, no hesitation. "And do you, Mira Elizabeth Langley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Mira's voice shook, but it carried. "I do." "The rings, please." Noah stepped forward, looking so proud and grown up it made Mira's eyes burn. He handed Reverend Michaels 2 simple gold bands, and the Reverend blessed them before giving one to Coulter. Coulter took Mira's left hand and slid the ring onto her finger with infinite gentleness. "With this ring," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I thee wed." Then it was Mira's turn. She took the second ring and slid it onto Coulter's finger, her hands trembling but steady enough. "With this ring, I thee wed." "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Reverend Michaels said, smiling, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Reeves, you may kiss your bride." Coulter didn't wait for permission. He pulled Mira into his arms and kissed her like he'd been waiting his entire life to do it, deep and thorough and full of promise. The church erupted in applause and cheers, the children whooping with delight, but Mira barely heard it. All she knew was Coulter's mouth on hers, his arms around her, his heart beating against her chest in perfect rhythm with her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Coulter rested his forehead against hers. "Hello, Mrs. Reeves," he whispered. "Hello, husband," Mira whispered back. And just like that, everything that had been broken became whole. The reception was held in the church hall, tables laden with food that the community had contributed despite their reservations. Mira moved through the crowd on Coulter's arm, accepting congratulations from people who'd whispered about her just weeks before. Some seemed genuinely happy for them. Others were clearly there out of obligation or curiosity. But Mira didn't care. She was too busy watching Liddy dance in circles with Cal, watching Noah actually smile and laugh with some of the other boys his age, watching Coulter relax in a way she'd never seen him do in public. At one point, Helena Pritchard approached them, her face tight but civil. "Congratulations," she said stiffly. "Thank you," Mira replied, keeping her voice pleasant. Helena hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I may have misjudged you. Perhaps. What you did, saving that child, taking that bullet, that's not something someone with selfish intentions would do." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. Mira accepted it with grace. "Thank you for saying so." Helena nodded once and swept away, and Coulter looked down at Mira with raised eyebrows. Did Helena Pritchard just admit she was wrong? I think she did. Maybe miracles do happen. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Coulter pulled Mira aside to a quiet corner of the hall. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A wedding gift." "Coulter, you didn't need to." "I wanted to." He pulled out a small leather journal, worn but well kept, and placed it in her hands. This was Sarah's. Her recipes, mostly, but also some thoughts, some stories she wrote down. "I want you to have it." Mira stared at the journal, overwhelmed. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." His voice was gentle. "You're part of this family now, part of its history and its future. Sarah would want you to have it, would want you to add your own recipes, your own stories, make it ours instead of just mine." Tears spilled down Mira's cheeks as she opened the journal and saw Sarah's handwriting, delicate and precise. On the first page she'd written, "For my children, so they always remember where they came from." Underneath, in fresh ink, Coulter had added, "And for Mira, who helped them remember where they're going." "Thank you," Mira whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me a home when I had nowhere else to go." "No," Coulter said, pulling her close. "Thank you. For bringing us back to life, for teaching us how to be a family again, for loving my children like they're yours, for being brave enough to stay." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the celebration continued around them. Then Liddy appeared, tugging on Mira's skirt. "Mama, can we go home now? I want to show you the surprise we made." "Mama." The word still sent warmth flooding through Mira's chest every time she heard it. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go home." Home. The word had never sounded so perfect. They rode back to the ranch as a family, all 5 of them crowded into the wagon, Liddy falling asleep against Mira's shoulder, the boys arguing good-naturedly about who got to drive the horses tomorrow, Coulter's arm around Mira's waist anchoring her to this moment, this life, this impossible happiness. When they arrived, the children raced ahead to the house, and Coulter helped Mira down from the wagon with exaggerated courtesy that made her laugh. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reeves," he said formally, then swept her into his arms without warning. "Coulter, what are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It's tradition." "We've already lived here for months." "Doesn't matter. You're my wife now. Everything starts fresh." He carried her up the porch steps and through the door, and Mira gasped. The house had been transformed. Wildflowers filled every available surface, their sweet scent perfuming the air. Candles glowed softly in the windows. And on the mantel above the fireplace, someone had arranged Cal's wooden carvings, the entire menagerie, around a new carving she'd never seen before. A family. 2 adults and 3 children carved in simple lines but unmistakable. "The children did this," Coulter said softly, setting her down. "While we were in town. They wanted you to know you're really part of this family now." Mira crossed to the mantel and picked up the carving with trembling hands. The figures were holding hands, connected, complete. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect," Coulter corrected, coming to stand behind her. "And you're mine. Finally, officially, irrevocably mine." She turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Yours, she agreed. Always. The children appeared then, fresh from washing up, their faces bright with exhaustion and happiness. Did you like the surprise? Liddy asked anxiously. I loved it, Mira assured her, pulling the little girl into a hug. It's the best gift anyone's ever given me. Better than the ranch? Cal asked. Mira laughed. Better than anything, because it means I have all of you, and that's all I've ever wanted. That night, after the children had been tucked into bed with kisses and promises of tomorrow, Coulter and Mira stood together at the bedroom window, looking out over their land bathed in moonlight. Do you ever think about that day in Wolf Hollow? Mira asked quietly. About what would have happened if you hadn't stopped. Every day, Coulter admitted. And every day I'm grateful I did. Grateful that something made me look at you and see not just a girl in trouble, but someone worth fighting for. I was so angry that day, Mira said. Angry at my father for dying, at Porter for tying me up, at the whole world for being cruel. But then you cut those ropes, and it was like I could breathe again. You saved me too, you know, Coulter said. Maybe not from ropes or bullets, but from something just as deadly. Grief, loneliness, the slow death of forgetting how to hope. Mira turned to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. We saved each other then. Yeah. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. We did. They made love that night with a tenderness that brought tears to both their eyes, every touch a promise, every kiss a vow. And afterward, lying tangled together in the moonlit darkness, Mira felt a peace she'd never known was possible. She'd started this journey tied to a fence, branded a burden, destined for a fate worse than death. And she'd ended it here, in the arms of a man who loved her, surrounded by children who called her mama, owning half of the most beautiful land she'd ever seen. From shame to sanctuary. From debt to destiny. From burden to beloved. She'd earned every single step of that transformation, earned it with courage and hard work, and the simple refusal to let cruelty define her worth. Coulter? She whispered into the darkness. Thank you. For seeing me when everyone else just looked away. His arms tightened around her. Thank you for letting me. For trusting me enough to stay. Always, she promised. I'll always stay. And as sleep pulled her under, warm and safe and loved beyond measure, Mira Langley Reeves smiled. Because she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not a home, not wealth, not even safety. She'd found belonging. And that made all the difference. Outside, the valley slept beneath a blanket of stars. The creek sang its endless song, and the wind whispered through the aspens like a blessing. Tomorrow, they'd wake to the work of the ranch, to fences that needed mending, and horses that needed training, and a life that demanded everything they had to give. But they'd face it together, as partners, as equals, as family. And that was more than enough. That was everything. The end.